Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jack Batten, and I am the Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. Program here at Yale. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's discussion with Adam Kirsch on his new book, On Settler Colonialism, Ideology, Violence, and Justice. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley Program. The William F. Buckley Jr. Program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 750 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. I also want to emphasize the Buckley program's commitment to freedom of speech. Disruption of an event is not consistent with Yale's policies on free expression, as outlined in the Woodward Report. I would ask that each of you respect the right of our speakers to be heard and the right of your fellow audience members to listen to the event. Thank you for joining us in upholding the value of free speech. Now for our guest. Adam Kirsch is a poet, literary critic, and editor at the Wall Street Journal's Weekend Review section, whose writing appears regularly in The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, and other publications. He is the author of 4 collections of poems, 3 collections of essays, and several books on Jewish literature and history. His new book, On Settler Colonialism, Ideology, Violence, and Justice, written in the aftermath of Hamas's October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel, has been described as a beautifully argued critique that is calm and graceful, but also smart, sustained, and fierce. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Kirsch to the Buckley Institute and to Yale.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Thank you all for coming out to listen to me today. I think I will spend the first part of our time just talking a little bit for maybe about 20 minutes, and then Jack and I will dialogue a little bit, and we'll have time for questions as well, so we can all converse. So as you heard, I wrote this book on settler colonialism. It's a short book, and I wrote it fairly rapidly after the October 7th, 2023 attack in Israel. And a number of books have been written in response to that, short books from different points of view. Mine is not about Israeli-Palestinian politics, on which I'm not an expert by any means. It's about the idea of settler colonialism, which I think emerged after October 7th as a very prominent strand in the pro-Palestinian or anti-Zionist response to the attack. So, like a lot of people, a lot of American Jews in particular, I was sort of surprised after October 7th that in the immediate aftermath, before the Israeli invasion of Gaza, which has cost so many lives since then and given rise to even more protests, but on October 7th itself, or on October 8th, you may remember that the news that Hamas had infiltrated fighters into Israel and killed about 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, was greeted with a surprising amount of approval and enthusiasm by certain groups, including on college campuses, elite ones like this one, and in progressive organizations like Democratic Socialists of America and Black Lives Matter, some university faculty. People came out and said not just that this was not, first of all, not that this was a crime against humanity, which is the way that people have traditionally spoken about lives lost in conflicts between Israel and Hamas, when the lives lost were Palestinian. In previous conflicts, there was sort of unanimous condemnation of killing civilians. This time, not only was there not a unanimous condemnation of killing Israeli civilians, but a lot of people celebrated it. And one thing that struck me right away was that a lot of the statements put out online or in publications supporting or extenuating the Hamas attack used the term settler colonial or settler colonialism to describe Israel. And so people said things like, the Hamas attack was resistance to settler colonialism, all means are justified in resisting settler colonialism, or Israelis are not civilians, they're settlers, and therefore they're all legitimate targets for attack. There was a sort of automatic assumption by a lot of people that because Israel was settler colonial and was associated with something called settler colonialism, that it was sort of right to attack it and make war on it, even in this particularly terroristic and heinous way. And that interested me because I've sort of been familiar with the idea of settler colonialism, seen it grow and sort of emerge as a pretty important academic concept in the humanities over the last, I'd say, 15 to 20 years. And it seemed to me that this was a moment when an academic idea had sort of emerged from the academy into the political life, into public life, and was influencing the way that people actually think and respond to current events. So that's especially true among younger people. One thing that I've said in talking about the book is that when I first started discussing it with my editor, who's my age, or actually a little bit older, she said, I haven't heard of the term settler colonialism, but when I spoke to the editorial assistants here, they all knew it. Meaning that it's something that if you studied in the last 10, 15 years, if you were an undergraduate, you probably have learned the idea of settler colonialism. And it's a very flexible idea that can find lots of different applications. You can find it discussed in terms of Native American history is one sort of obvious place, but also the Middle East, and also public health and gender studies, sexuality, the environment. All of these are ways that the idea of settler colonialism can be applied. So what I wanted to do in this short book, and what I'm going to talk about a little bit today, is just to look at when people say settler colonialism, what do they mean? What are the sources of that idea? Sort of who are the thinkers and the theorists who developed it, and the applications that they use it for, and why I think that it's sort of a bad idea or that deserves to be contested, which is what I try to do a little bit in the book. So just to step back a little bit into history, so after World War II, there was a global decolonization movement in which European empires were dismantled primarily in Africa and Asia. And so French and British colonies and also some other European countries either declared independence or fought for their independence and won it. And that took a variety of different forms in different places because colonization had taken a variety of forms. So for example, in India, the British had ruled India for hundreds of years but had never sent people to live there. There had been a sort of class of administrators and soldiers who had gone there to basically extract profit and exercise power, but not to create a new society, not to live there. So when the British withdrew from India and Pakistan in 1947, it wasn't a big population transfer. It was withdrawing sort of administrators and government and soldiers. But in other places, there were large numbers of European settlers in places like Algeria, where there was a large number of French settlers, and Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, where there was a large number of British settlers, and of course South Africa, which has a sort of complicated history of its own with Boer and English settlers. And in those places, when people talked about a settler colony, which is what the term originally comes from in the 1950s and 60s, a settler colony was a colony where there was a settler class. That class was maybe 15% in Algeria of the total population was European, and 85% was Arab and Berber. In Rhodesia, maybe 8% was European, and the rest was African. And the goal of decolonization in a settler colony like that was a very straightforward political struggle. It was to take power and property from settlers and return it to the native majority. And one of the dynamics of this process was that the settlers who were there sort of under the protection of a European government, to use the Algerian example, which is sort of the classic example, the French government regarded Algeria as part of France. And so as long as that was the case, French settlers in Algeria were sort of in charge. And the way that the Algerian independence movement succeeded was to raise the price for France so high that they decided it wasn't worth fighting this war anymore. And they said, okay, we're going to agree to Algerian independence. And after that happened, almost all of the European settlers left and went back to France very quickly after 1962. That was a case of decolonization, decolonizing a settler colony by essentially evicting the settlers. The kind of settler colonialism that's talked about now, I think, has a different meaning and sort of comes from a different place. So in the 1990s, starting in Australia and then spreading to the US and Canada, certain theorists began to talk about those countries as settler colonies or settler colonial societies. One of the first was an Australian anthropologist named Patrick Wolfe, who wrote a very influential book in 1999, I believe, in which he sort of introduced this term settler colonialism and made it popular among anthropologists and sociologists. And one of the most quoted sentences in this book that's often appears in writings on the subject where people are talking about it was, he said, invasion is a structure, not an event. And he was talking about Australian history. So what he meant was that the invasion of Australia by the British was not an event that happened in 1788 and in the following years and is now part of the past and it's over with. That we should think about a country that started with colonization as an ongoing process of settlement that continues to the present day. In other words, a country that started through European colonization remains a settler colonial society no matter how much time goes by. And that has two sort of implications. One is that in order to understand a modern 21st century society like that, and of course that applies to the United States, which is what I'll mainly be talking about, that in order to sort of reform what's wrong with the society, you have to view it through the lens of settler colonialism. And in that sense, settler colonial theory can be thought of as a critical theory like critical theory that was developed by Frankfurt School thinkers in the 50s and 60s. That was a Marxist critical theory that looked at modern Western society through the lens of class struggle and sort of analyzed culture and society through that lens. Critical race theory emerged in the 1970s and 1980s in law schools and sort of looked at American history primarily through the lens of slavery and racism. And settler colonial ideology or settler colonial theory, I think, is best understood as a kind of critical theory like this, which views modern contemporary American society through the lens of European colonization and settlement. And so I'll get into a little bit of what that means in detail. So that's one thing that it means. Another thing that it means is that there is a sort of implication that if invasion is a process and not an event, and it's always ongoing, that a settler colonial society can never be a legitimate sovereign over its territory. It's always a usurper or an occupier. It's always a sort of institutions and people are in a place where they're not supposed to be, and in the most just future wouldn't be. So the idea or ideal is decolonization, meaning people who are not indigenous, of indigenous ancestry, leave. And that is something that can't actually be brought about in practical terms in North America the way it could in a society where settlers made up a small minority of the population, because in the US, I think it's something like 98% of the population does not have indigenous origins. So there's no sort of concrete political strategy that you could imagine inducing 98% of the population to leave. That kind of decolonization is not on the program. There are certain theorists who I talk about in the book who do say in sort of vague terms that in the future, America will be decolonized, the United States won't exist, and native history will resume. Some people talk about ways that that could happen by ceding part of the territory of the United States for native homelands, or for a lot of theorists, it has to do with changing what we mean by sovereignty, what it means for a nation to control territory and sort of share sovereignty with native peoples. But one thing that I think is interesting and significant is that although the term settler colonialism is used a lot in the academy, it's not used by Native American advocacy groups. So this is not a political strategy by Native American groups. If you look at what those groups focus on, it tends to be things like respecting treaty obligations, holding the US government to legal obligations. They don't use the language of decolonizing North America, right? Because that's not a pragmatic political strategy. So what does it mean if you call for decolonizing a country that can't be decolonized in a practical way? Well, you've probably encountered the idea of decolonizing, the term decolonizing in different contexts. I think I started to hear it maybe about 7 or 8 years ago in different contexts. And it really has to do with changing both public institutional arrangements, things like economics and politics and society, and also with changing internally, changing the way you think and the way you conceive of yourself and the way you live. And both of those things can be connected, of course. So one popular thing, I don't know if it's said as much anymore, but there was a slogan of decolonize your bookshelf, meaning don't only read white authors, read authors of other backgrounds. People have written books on decolonize your garden, meaning only plant native species. not species that have been imported from somewhere else. But there's all kinds of ways to interpret decolonization that aren't about changing the population, right, expelling population. And so one thing that I say in the book is that there are a lot of similarities between this way of thinking and, ironically, the Calvinism of the Puritans, who were the original settler colonists in the United States, both in the sense that we are all we've all inherited an original sin. We've all inherited a sin that took place before our birth that we personally aren't responsible for, but we have inherited it and we're obligated to it, even though we ourselves might never have settled anything. That settler is an inherited identity, and that's an important part of this way of thinking. Really, it's a binary. You're either settler or an indigenous, and if you're not indigenous, you're a settler. And so there's lots of interesting debates within settler colonial studies about unsettling our typical ideas of who are the established and who are the oppressed in American society. So one of the debates that I talk about in the book is, if your ancestors came here as slaves from Africa, are you a settler today? And there are a number of people who would say, yes, you're a settler today because you are here settled on land that is not yours and you're not indigenous to it, therefore you occupy the position of a settler. So it doesn't matter whether you yourself are the person who settled the land. It doesn't matter whether your direct ancestors are the ones who settled the land, if they came over in the Mayflower, for example, or if your family immigrated here, 10 years ago. Structurally, so to speak, both of those people are settlers. They belong to the settler colonial society. So when you reflect on, when the Calvinists, the Puritans reflected on original sin, one of the most important things that you can do is to acknowledge it. Sort of the first step is to acknowledge, I am guilty of the sin, I was born with sin, because in a sort of surprising or inverted way, knowing that you are responsible for a sin, knowing that you are sinful, makes you better than people who don't know it, right? People who will not acknowledge that they have this sin are not on the path to salvation, not on the path to grace. And I think that there's a certain dynamic like that in the world of settler colonial studies, where people are eager to announce themselves as settlers, to claim that settler identity, because it's a way of showing that they understand the guilt that they've inherited in the position that they're in. And there are certain people who will say settler in their author ID, or even in social media bios, they'll describe themselves as settler. I think that's more popular in Canada than it is here, but I think you can see it more and more. And there's a whole sort of literature of people wrestling with what it means to be a settler, especially, I think, a lot of young people that you can see in student newspapers, for example, or in social media or online writing, where people want to purge themselves of what is referred to often in this field as settler ways of being. A settler way of being it can be all different kinds of things, but essentially what settler colonialism comes to mean is exploitation, greed, rapacity, all of the sort of qualities that brought Europeans to North America and led them to conquer it and spread across it, take all the land, destroy the native peoples, and then take resources out of it and sort of despoil it. All of those qualities are thought of as settler colonial qualities. And so reforming settler colonialism or decolonizing can mean putting an end to income inequality, to capitalism, to using natural resources like coal and gas. All of those things can be linked to settler colonialism, at least rhetorically, and also things that are even more sort of speculative about compulsory heterosexuality can be thought of as a settler legacy, or the idea of monogamous marriage has been described as a settler legacy. So a lot of things that the progressive sort of critique would have looked at anyway as desirable things or as things to oppose or to work for can be re-described and re-understood as legacies of settler colonialism in the context of American politics. So that is sort of the first half of the book, talking about those things. And then in the second half of the book, and I'll now turn to, why does this term show up so much in talking about Israel, and why was it so important in shaping the way that a lot of people responded to October 7th and have been responding to the events since then? I think that the idea that Israel is a settler colonial country has been part of this way of thinking really from the beginning. Patrick Wolf writes about Israel as a settler colonial country 25 years ago. But only Israel is a settler colonial society that you can imagine disappearing, that you can imagine actually fighting and overcoming. It's very hard to imagine that happening in Australia, Canada, or the United States. And so when people talk about fighting settler colonialism, in those places they're talking about much more abstract kinds of change. But if you're fighting settler colonialism in Israel, you're fighting it with bombs and guns because you're trying to destroy or unmake a settler colonial state. That, I think, is how you got to the sort of strange sight that we saw after October 7th and since then, maybe in waves, of people who consider themselves progressives allying themselves with or celebrating Hamas, which is a religious fundamentalist organization, saying that Hamas is sort of objectively on the right side of this struggle because it is fighting Israeli settler colonialism, it's fighting a national liberation struggle, and so people have adopted Hamas symbols or waved Hamas flags, in a way seeing that if settler colonialism is the main enemy, if it's the main thing that's wrong in the world, if it's responsible for so much of what's wrong with the world, then those who fight settler colonialism are on the right side. There have been some interesting moments in the way that the Israel-Palestine struggle has been tied up with this idea. One came in 2016 at the Standing Rock protests. I don't know if anyone remembers that or is familiar with that, but in 2016 there was a sort of celebrated protest in North Dakota where the Standing Rock Sioux protested the construction of an oil pipeline that was going to be dug underneath their land, and it became a sort of rallying point for a number of different progressive causes, and one of them was Palestinian liberation, and there was a book published called From Standing Rock to Gaza, which was a slogan for some of the protests, and the idea was that Palestinians in Gaza and Native Americans in North America are both essentially fighting the same struggle because they're both indigenous peoples fighting settler colonial regimes. That's a new way of thinking about, certainly about Palestinian struggle. Earlier generations of Palestinian leadership did not want to be compared to Native Americans because they saw that as a defeatist proposition. But that's changed a lot, especially among younger people, and I think that shift has a lot to do with the change in opinion among younger people that you see in polls about whether they support Israel or Hamas in this conflict. Traditionally, and still in older age groups, Americans have said that they support Israel by about 80 to 20, and for people aged 18 to 24, it's more like 50-50. And I think that people have started to see that conflict in a new way, in a different way. One of the things that I write about in the book is ways in which the model of settler colonialism as applied to European colonization sort of doesn't capture the reality of what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And there are historical reasons for that, which I can talk more about, maybe we'll get into later. But I think that the main, most important thing to say about it is if the goal of the Palestinian struggle is decolonization, meaning to end the existence of Israel as a Jewish state, which is what is sort of meant by the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that means that Israelis have to see this as an existential war to the death for their survival. And unlike settler colonies such as Algeria or Rhodesia or South Africa, where there were homelands, or their mother countries, because those were countries that were founded by colonization from an empire. Israel was founded by refugees from Europe and later from the Arab world, who were not sent there to extend imperial power, but were fleeing imperial power. They were fleeing persecution in other places. And there is no mother country of Israel, as there would be for a true settler colony. So when the prospect is the destruction of the country, in a place like Algeria, eventually that war could end without a mass slaughter because there was a mother country for settlers to go to. They could leave. For Israel, there is no place for people to go to, which is one reason why that scenario is sometimes referred to as pushing Israelis into the sea, which is a term that has been used for 50 or 60 years, which is a euphemism for genocide, a euphemism for mass murder. That's the sort of end game of the destruction of the state of Israel, certainly for Hamas. There are other people who say that Israel could cease to be a Jewish state and become a binational state or a state of all its citizens. I think that's very impractical for other reasons, but certainly the idea that you're going to destroy the Jewish state or remove the Jewish presence is a recipe for massive continued conflict and violence. So where I come down at the end in this book is to say, it's not necessary and it's not rational or just to deny the violent histories of North America and Australia or of Israel and Palestine, or to deny the suffering of indigenous peoples in those places. But there are, the past sort of cannot be changed. The past cannot be redeemed in the way that a lot of this thinking likes to do imaginatively, to sort of imagine a world in which America never existed, or Europeans never discovered North America, or that the state of Israel was never created, and that sort of the ideal would be to restore that condition. That in order to sort of make peace, you have to think not about the past, but about the future, and what is a desirable future for the actual people living in these places. And I think that when you think about what is a desirable future for Arabs and Jews living in Israel and Palestine, a fight to destroy the state of Israel is not the path to a good future for either of those peoples. I would say that the sort of path to the only conceivable good outcome would be some kind of a two-state solution which allows both peoples who have valid, legitimate claims to a homeland in this place to exercise those claims. I know that that's not something that's on the near horizon, and it's something that very few people on either side there really want or are working for at this moment. But I think the only other alternatives are so much worse that it's hard to imagine anything else that you would want to happen there or to work for. So maybe that's a good place for me to stop. Now it's at 4:30, halfway through our time, and we could move to questions.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'll just start off with the question. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the last point you made, which relates to how, kind of researching this book has forced you to, delve into the, a lot of history around European colonialism. And I wonder if you could describe how the motivations for, and, sort of the origins of European colonialism differ from the origins of the founding of the State of Israel and its continued existence.
So one of the sort of tenets or the sort of assumptions of most settler colonial theory is that Zionism is a European colonial movement, that Zionism is a form of European colonialism like the kinds of European colonialism that created the United States, Canada, Australia, or other colonies around the world. And part of that has to do with mapping categories that we're familiar with in American history in particular onto a place that has a very different history, so that it becomes a story of a white European colonizer eliminating or replacing a non-white indigenous people. One reason why, and I've talked about what some of the consequences of that are for projecting into the future, but just as a historical matter, one thing that requires is denying that Jews are an indigenous people in the land of Israel. And it's sort of the very basis of Zionism as a political movement is precisely that it was the return of an indigenous people to its ancient homeland. So simply from the point of view of how did Zionism understand itself, how do modern Israelis understand themselves, to say that they are white European colonizers sort of gets that story wrong and even backwards in a certain way. When both parties to the conflict see themselves as indigenous, you have a very different kind of situation than if one party sees itself as a European settlers or colonizers and the other is an indigenous people that was defeated, because that's a conflict that can't be really resolved through decolonization. If both peoples have valid claims that both people are indigenous in some way to this place. One thing I say in the book is that if you could imagine a partial decolonization of North America so that the US sort of ceded maybe one state, like Arizona, to Native peoples and said this will be a homeland for Native peoples and all Native peoples from North America can move there, create a new society, and restore their native languages, the result would be Zionism. That's what Zionism was for the Jewish people. It was returning from exile in many different places to the historic ancient homeland. This is an ancient homeland that was left 2,000 years ago rather than 200 or 400 years ago, but an ancient homeland, and restoring Hebrew as a spoken language and building a new society. All of those are sort of similar achievements. When we think about colonialism, settler colonialism, another way that this feeds into the debate over Israel and Palestine, in particular to the language of protest over the last year and a half is that settler colonialism is very much engaged with and sort of founded on the idea of genocide. That's another thing that has been part of the field from the beginning, that settler colonialism means a colonizer commits a genocide of a native people to empty the land and take it from them. And that is a plausible description of what happened in Australia in certain ways and maybe in North America, although it doesn't account for the fact, it doesn't account for the history of what happened, but you can understand it as a model. And I think that one reason why the Israeli war in Gaza has been so readily described by progressives and by opponents of Israel as a genocide is because it draws on that basic idea that as a settler colonial society, the existence of Israel was founded on evicting and destroying a native people, that it was a genocidal act, that the state, sort of the existence of the state is a result of genocide, and therefore this war in Gaza is sort of an extension of that genocide. And that's something that a lot of people will say directly, will say exactly that, including Francesca Albanese, who's the UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine, who says things like that and has said that the genocide is going on not only in Gaza where there's a war, but in the West Bank where there's not a war, because sort of the existence of Israel, the control of these places is definitionally genocidal. So the fact that the sort of history of the population of Gaza is of sort of unbroken growth, or that the Palestinian population has gone up something like 5 times since 1948, which is the exact opposite of the Native American population after British settlement in North America. Those things speak very strongly against the idea that Israel is committing a genocide or has committed a genocide in any sort of ordinary sense of that term. And so to understand why that term is so necessary, has become such a necessary part of the debate, I think you have to look, one place you have to look is at ideas of settler colonialism, how they influence the way that people, especially academics and theorists, think about that conflict.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. One other thing you bring up in the book is the relationship between settler colonialism and progressivism. And you make a very interesting point, which is that settler colonialism, which is this kind of regressive idea, is almost contradictory to progressivism, which is a very forward-looking idea. I wonder if you could speak more on this.
Well, I think that most of the people who talk about settler colonialism would call themselves progressives, right? They would consider themselves progressives, but it's a very different idea from most progressive ideas, because most progressive ideas are majoritarian. They're about advantaging the majority at the expense of a minority. And sort of a classic example of that could be Occupy Wall Street. In 2010, or 2011, there was a big protest movement called Occupy Wall Street, where people camped out for a very long time, months, almost a year, in a park in Lower Manhattan, and it became a nationwide Occupy movement. And it was a criticism of capitalism, of finance capitalism, and the slogan was that it was representing the 99%. We are the 99%. And that is a sort of classic progressive slogan that you could also see in a progressive movement, you know, like the French Revolution or communism. The idea is that the reason why things are wrong in the world is that there's a very small group of people that has taken all the power and resources for themselves, and we're going to take it back from them and restore it to the people, the majority who rightly own it. And as some writers on settler colonialism will frankly acknowledge, the calculation of that in America is exactly the opposite. It's really about saying this land rightfully belongs to 2% of the population, and the 98% of the population should give it up, leave, or atone for their presence in some way. So it is not a movement, it's not an idea that you could make a mass politics out of, and I don't think that decolonization is a mass politics. It's not the kind of thing that is going to win huge amounts of support or become politically a majority. But what it does do is it appeals to political avant-gardes and elites who see it as a way of understanding history that gives them sort of superior insight into what's going on and what's wrong with our society. And so it can be very appealing to small numbers of people, even if it's not going to be appealing to, I think, the majority of people. And then another element of this is it's very hard for settler colonial theorists to say what would a successful decolonization look like? What would a decolonized future be? one example that often comes up has to do with the environment, right? Climate change and the climate crisis. There's a sort of line of critique that says, in the same way that ever since Columbus, Europeans came to North America and greedily, rapaciously consumed all the land and took everything for themselves, that settler colonial sort of mindset or DNA is at the heart of Western civilization, and that is responsible for using up the Earth's resources and burning oil and coal and gas. And so settler colonialism is responsible for the climate crisis. And I talk about some people in the book who will say exactly that. The problem with that is that if you look at the countries that are the biggest contributors to climate change, who produce the most carbon emissions, the biggest ones are China and India, which are not settler colonial powers. And in fact, for them, achieving industrial power like that is an anti-colonial achievement, because it's saying these are countries that were once sort of pushed around by the European powers, and now they're much bigger and stronger and able to produce all these things for themselves. So it's hard to imagine a future in which people don't want fossil fuels, in which people don't want cars or consumer goods. And saying that in some way decolonizing will achieve that, I think is just wrong. It's an illusion generated by ideological thinking. So instead of being about progress toward a plausible future, it's much more about looking at the past and sort of wanting to redeem it, wanting to sort of fix the wrong turning that the past has taken.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll open it up to audience Q&A now.
Thank you for coming to speak today about your book. I kind of want to go back to the beginning of your talk when you talked about how there's a difference between how academia sort of defines settler colonialism and how that doesn't really see a representation, particularly with Native Americans and their own self-definition. As we see with the Israel-Palestine conflict, Jews are at the forefront of both the academic and student initiatives, both the pro-Palestine initiatives and the pro-Israel initiatives. And there's this complex, self-definition, whereas the Palestinian counter-definition, for the most part, is comparatively very clear. How do you think that this sort of lack of self-definition complicates the Jewish perspective and the entire conflict?
That's a really good question and a very wide-ranging one. But one way to pose the question is, a lot of the response to anti-Israel activism by Jews and others as well is to call it anti-Semitic, is to say that it's anti-Semitic. And this is, I think, has shaped the government, right? The way the government is currently responding to universities is a lot of it is under the rubric of combating anti-Semitism, making sure that universities combat anti-Semitism. But as you say, a lot of the participants in the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist movements are Jewish. Some of their leaders are Jewish, and at Columbia, for example, last year during the height of the protests, which was about a year ago at Passover, there was a Seder, a Passover ritual meal held at the protest encampment, the Gaza Solidarity encampment at Columbia. So I think that what that shows you is that the idea of Zionism is contested within the Jewish community. There are people who think that, I'd say that the majority of American Jews think that Zionism is an important part of their identity, but there is a minority that doesn't, and I think that's especially among younger people, who don't see Zionism as the same kind of cause, natural cause that older Jews did, in part because of the ongoing violence and cost of the occupation of the West Bank and the conflict in Gaza. So I think it is complicated, that there are Jewish voices on both sides of that debate. That's sort of another question, another subject entirely about Zionism and Jewishness. But yes, I think that it is more complicated. What I would say in the context of settler colonialism is that people who want peace and peaceful resolution of that conflict shouldn't use the language of settler colonialism, because it actually encourages the opposite.
Really appreciate your remarks. Your reference to anti-Semitism and how it's not helpful to use things like words like terms like settler colonialism, couldn't agree with more. And I have a hard time accepting a lot of these slogans. Like, people throw words around like Zionist, or it's kind of funny, though, how the very people who are accusing Israel of genocide or whatever, they choose to define it through this lens of the settler colonialism thing that you're talking about. One could also define it through a different lens. Let's look at the Mideast as, who's pro-LGBTQ and who's anti-LGBTQ, who's pro-misogyny and anti-misogyny, all right? And the whole thing will be turned upside down. So the ineluctable conclusion I have from that is it's a very veiled, not so veiled way of being anti-Semitic. And how do you get past that nuance? They hide behind, we're just anti-Zionist, we're not anti-Semitic. When in fact that you look at Jewish students being attacked on campus, okay, I don't see people who are dark-skinned being attacked when there's some violence in Africa. You don't see, Asian Americans being attacked when there's some horrendous crime in China. But somehow Jewish students are fair game when something's going on in Israel. How would you respond to that?
I think you're right that, yes, Jewish students are singled out and made answerable for things going on in Israel in a way that no other group is. I think that if I were to imagine what would be, why a person doing that singling out would explain it, they would say that it's because America has a lot of influence over Israel's conduct. And so if you protest in America in a way that can change the American government, you could change the conduct of the Israeli government. So it's rational in a way to do that. Whereas if you protested the conduct of the Chinese government in Tibet, here it would basically have no effect because America doesn't have nearly as much leverage over the Chinese government as it does over the Israeli government. That's sort of a practical, pragmatic answer. Another answer has to do with the conspicuousness of Jews in American society and maybe even more broadly in Western civilization and Western imagination, that there's a long tradition of thinking about moral issues and political questions by thinking about Jews. And so in a certain way, settler colonialism and also nationalism more broadly is now often litigated in terms of Jewish nationalism and Israel, which is historically very ironic when you think about how Israel was created and under what circumstances. But I do think that a lot of people, you saw this, for example, in Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, The Message, which I think was a very honest and I respected it, because what he was saying was he went to the West Bank and he saw the oppression and the division there, and he was shocked by it, and as many, many, many other people who've been there have said, and came back and wrote about it. And he actually wrote about it in the context of a couple of different other countries in that book as well. But the thing that he sort of went around saying, or was on TV saying, was, I don't believe in ethno-states, and Israel is an ethno-state. Well, why is it that Israel is the ethno-state? Why isn't it every other country in the world that has a majority ethnicity and majority public? Why isn't it France? Why isn't it Han China? The reason is that Jews are sort of a traditional concept that Western civilization uses to think about things that it doesn't like in itself. And one thing that I often talk about when talking about this is there's a book by a historian called David Nuremberg that I would highly recommend called Anti-Judaism. And it looks at sort of the history of thinking about Judaism, but even starting before Christianity, then under Christianity, and in secular modern Europe, and how there's this consistent pattern of the things that we are against or don't want to see in ourselves, we project onto Jews and Jewishness. So I think that there's something like that happening with the idea of nationalism or ethnic nationalism. The great irony of that is that the Zionist movement was created at a time when ethnic nationalism under the name of the nation state was considered the most progressive position. The most progressive thing you could be was a nationalist, because at that time, people in Germany and Italy, and then in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Poland and Ukraine were all being ruled by foreign empires. And so they said, we want to have a state of our own nation, a nation state. Every nation deserves to have its own state where it can be in control of its own destiny. That wasn't considered a reactionary racist idea. That was considered a liberation idea. Israel is probably the last country created under the impetus of that idea. And as a result, it often gets sort of blamed for the whole idea of nationalism, or it's all discussed in terms of Israel.
Further questions?
So, common practice in this country, if you don't like a business, let's say
You don't like the pillow guy because he's far right wing. So you don't shop there, okay? All these students who go apply to these colleges, right? They know beforehand, if they care to look, where the endowment invests their money. Where do they come off going to these schools to begin with? If they're so self-righteous about it, why not go to a school that doesn't invest however much money in whatever companies that are objected? It just reeks of hypocrisy. I can say the same thing about Chick-fil-A. It falls into the same category as the pillow guy, but most people 18 to 22 years old, somehow they go there, okay, in droves. To me, the whole thing reeks of hypocrisy, and the only explanation I can have is it's anti-Semitism.
I don't think that anyone goes to college on the basis of where the endowment is invested. I don't think anyone applies to or knows anything about where the endowment is invested, and that probably includes people who are critical of it as well as people who are indifferent to it. I don't think that's really the issue at all. I think the issue is that college campuses have always been places where there's a lot of political activism because it's where you get a lot of young, idealistic people with strong ideas, and it's different causes at different times. And I think that since October 7th, this has been a center of this has been the most conspicuous cause, in part because it's a place where there's a war going on, where a lot of innocent people are being killed, and so it gets a lot of attention. I don't think that you have to, I wouldn't expect a student to say, I should, depending on where the endowment is invested, I won't complain. And I don't even think that would be right. I mean, there are things that, there are injustices in the world that should be protested against, right? And obviously killing lots of innocent people in Gaza is an injustice. The question is, when you protest against it, how do you understand it? What do you think you're going to accomplish? What is the end game? I think that those are more important questions. There's someone down here who had a question.
Hi, I am an Anglican, Jewish, Hindu person from Trinidad. And in starting to follow what was going on in Israel, I decided to look for news elsewhere. And I found a lot of information about the Caribbean countries, which were colonized, being pro-Palestinian, but they're anti-Hamas first. And I am just not seeing that in American reporting.
Yeah.
We have history of Syrians, Lebanese, Jews living together. So there's a whole range of people that don't understand why that's happening over there. Also here at the Jackson Institute a while back, there was a talk, and it was Northern Ireland and Colombia, lessons in peace.
Yeah.
Have you seen more, like I'm not aware of, but second world countries, hearing their feedback, hearing their input to make this change? Because even though they may be considered settler countries, the big difference between the US and those countries is education. So they can have higher education. Here in the US, that's still from slaves, is not allowed. What is your thinking about incorporating second world countries more? Because we have a great rapport with China.
Yeah.
My family's Chinese, my family's Indian.
Yeah. Well, so I think that the main point, I mean, early in Israel's history, I think it had more of a identification with what was then called the non-aligned countries, second world countries that were sort of neither the big superpowers, but somewhere in between. I think that now there is a lot more animus against Israel on religious and ethnic and political lines that makes that unlikely. It makes that unlikely to happen. But I do think that the Northern Ireland example is a potentially heartening example, because that's a conflict that, if I'm old enough to remember, was once the worst terrorist conflict in the world in the 1970s and 80s, and featured constant bombing and assassination and innocent people being killed, and was eventually actually not fully resolved, but restored to a state of peace in the Good Friday agreements. That was a lot easier to solve than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is going to be to solve. But maybe it's at least a reminder that conflicts that seem insoluble can eventually be solved. Yeah.
Yeah, more questions.
So I have a question about, like, you were talking earlier about how the protests, one thing that they don't really address is, sure, we're against innocent civilian death, but what are the implications of you being opposed, right? Who do you blame? So I haven't looked into the settler colonialist intellectual world, but I'm wondering, how do they address, Hamas's use of human shields, like repetitive rejections of various territorial offers and deals? Like, how does animus completely land on Israel intellectually?
Well, I think that, different people would say different things, so I don't want to speak for everyone as a group or anyone as a group, but I think that the settler colonial framing fundamentally is Jews are the people who are not supposed to be there. And so basically any attempt to sort of decolonize, to disestablish Israel is sort of ipso facto, that's the right side to be on. And if it could be done, there are some people who want that to be done nonviolently, and there are some people who don't care and are very angry and see it as a war, and see it as, in a war you defeat your enemies and you kill them if possible. I think that is more common than any kind of attempt to understand the other side. And I think that that's true of any country at war, right? I think it was true, sometimes I think about this in terms of the United States after 9/11, that after 9/11, no one wanted to hear about peaceful solutions or what are the root causes of grievances or things like that. They wanted to defeat the enemy and achieve security, and I think that Israel is following the same imperative in Gaza. The question is whether after 18 months it can achieve that goal. Yeah, there's someone in the back.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if you can mention or discuss why you aren't talking about South Africa at all.
Yeah. So South Africa is often brought up as an alternative sort of happy ending to this situation. Like, what is a happy ending? It would be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It would be sort of dismantling occupation in the West Bank. That's a sort of model of decolonization, right? I think that I understand why people think that. I think that it's very difficult to apply that model to a conflict like the Israel-Palestine conflict, which I think is much more geopolitical than it is racial. It's about two peoples who are actually about the same in size. If you look at the total population between the river and the sea, or what was once historic Palestine, now almost all of that territory is controlled by the Israeli government one way or another, but the actual population is about evenly divided between Jews and Arabs. And so it's not a situation in which you have a sort of, again, this is like other kinds of settler colonialism, it's not a situation where you have a small settler class ruling over a much larger native people. It's more like you have two nations of about the same size fighting over control of territory. And so I don't think that, there are people who say the ideal endgame for Israel would be a binational state where Israelis and Arabs live together under the same government. That seems very unrealistic to me. It seems very unrealistic to say that people who have been fighting wars and killing each other and inflicting these terrible injuries on each other would actually get along better if they didn't have separate governments, if they didn't have separate militaries, but had to all live together. That doesn't seem probable to me. So I think that, I would say that it is an understandable parallel, but maybe not one that fits in the end.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you for speaking with us today. So one thing that I thought, one thing that I thought that was interesting is you called for a 2-state solution in your speech. Presumably, this would the Palestinian state would include the West Bank. But another thing you highlighted is or conceded is that most people in Israel are not ready for this, and you have people like Smotrich and the Smotrich plan saying the quiet part, like kind of out loud, which is to like the role of these expansion of settlements in the West Bank is to change the facts on the ground, so that way the only, I guess, plausible solution would be to either get all of the Palestinians there to either leave or be willing to become part of Israel or be killed. So when you have, I guess, that reality over the situation there, I guess what do you make of that? Would that be considered settler colonialism? Yeah, thank you. I look forward to hearing.
Yeah, I think that in the West Bank is where you have something that's more like a classic settler colonial situation, where you have the government is basically ruling in the interest of a minority over a much larger population that doesn't have full rights. It doesn't. It's more complicated than that, because also a lot of that territory is governed by the Palestinian Authority and by Fatah, which is a party. So it's an incredibly complex political situation, which I'm not an expert in by any means. I think that Israel has been in control of Gaza and the West Bank starting in 1967 in the Six-Day War. That's almost 60 years ago. And in that 60 years, it has not tried to expel and certainly not tried to kill Palestinians from those territories. It has attempted to create new Jewish communities on those territories, a few in Gaza that were then dismantled in 2005, and many more successfully in the West Bank, which Jews in Israel called Judea, or Maimoni called Judea and Samaria. I think one reason why the conflict is very difficult to solve and why it won't be solved anytime soon is that there is zero trust on either side. And speaking from the Israeli point of view, their feeling about Gaza is we withdrew from Gaza in 2005 and it soon became a Hamas bastion, and ever since Hamas has been using it to attack us. And since on October 7th attacked very successfully and killed a lot of people. And they would say, if we did the same thing in the West Bank, then we would have Hamas 10 miles from our capital or from our airport. So in a way, it's sort of existentially impossible for there to be two states, right? On the other hand, I don't know what other solution there could be. So that's the part where it's hard to see how you get there from here, how you get to that conclusion from here. I certainly don't know. I don't think anyone knows, but that's sort of how I see it.
Maybe one more question. Any brave souls?
So I have the same question about the Shtachim, but you answered that already. And I have another question. So in the German pro-Israeli left, there's a strong narrative that I personally find appealing too. I don't know if you maybe be reluctant to it, that the sheer talk of Israel as especially artificial sort of state is anti-Semitic. It has anti-Semitic roots in Alfred Rosenberg, Adolf Hitler. You have it in the extreme left, extreme right in Germany in the 60s, 70s, and Iran would never speak today of the state of Israel. Would you say that there is something similar in settler colonialism as a concept? Probably one would have to look at authors more closely. And yeah, I've not read any settler colonialist literature, so I don't want to be suspicious in general, but this is what pops up in certain German mindsets.
Yeah. No, I think, it's something that different people would say different things about, but I think that maybe the most extreme people do, and I talk about this a little bit in the book too, do end up sort of back at classic anti-Semitic and even German nationalist ways of thinking about blood and soil, saying that that if a people is indigenous, that means they have unique understanding of and links to the blood and soil of this place, and so other people can't possibly belong there the way that the native people do. That was something that in Nazi Germany was said against Jews, and now it's something that some theorists and activists say against Jews in Israel, that Palestinians are the indigenous people, Jews are colonizers, and therefore they can't have that sort of link with the land. So it's possible, yeah, it can end up in that kind of a place.
All right, if you could please join me in thanking Mr. Kirsch.
Thank you.